This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business media, think tanks, and the political arena. I'm Joel Anand-Sami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardorch, economist and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. At America's Roundtable, we are pleased to have as one of our distinguished guests returning this weekend, Roger Helmer, a member of the European Parliament representing the United Kingdom. Mr. Helmer was first elected to the European Parliament in 1999 and has been kept very busy ever since, representing the interests of his 4.1 million constituents in the East Midlands. During the course of his long business career before 1999, he spent a total of 12 years running businesses in East and Southeast Asia as a resident, so he brings a wealth of detailed knowledge of the region to his work on these interparliamentary delegations. And Roger remains engaged in monitoring the EU enlargement process, primarily through his leadership in the Balkan region and advancing the rule of law and economic freedom. He has earned a reputation and even the grudging respect of political opponents for his clear, consistent, and forthright approach to the question of Britain's relationship with the European Union. He believes that most of his constituents would be happy with the sort of relationship the British people thought they had voted for in the 1975 referendum, a relationship based on free trade and voluntary cooperation. In fact, Roger has published 2 books on European issues titled Straight Talking on Europe in 2000, followed by A Declaration of Independence in 2002. Mr. Roger Helmer, it is great to have you rejoin us on America's Roundtable. Welcome.
My pleasure to be with you.
Welcome, Roger.
Thank you very much indeed, Natasha.
In fact, the Brookings Institution's William Galston stated recently in a report that at a time when everyone in Washington wants to talk about making a pivot to Asia, both economically and politically, he states it would be tempting to dismiss President Obama's decision announced in his State of the Union address to pursue a United States-European Union free trade area. It would also be a big mistake. The fact is the U.S. and the EU have it in their power to enact a potentially game-changing policy that could boost economic growth on both sides of the Atlantic, help the transatlantic allies deal more effectively with a rising China, and fill the void left by the collapse of global trade talks. Mr. Galston continues by stating, the focus on China's surge during the past decade has obscured the continuing strength of Europe and the United States and their continuing importance for each other. In 2011, the transatlantic economy represented about half of world GDP and $5 trillion in total commercial sales. Taken together, the EU and the US account for 25% of global exports and 32% of global imports. And despite their recent travails, transatlantic consumers retain enormous purchasing power, and the GDP per capita is about $50,000 in the US and $32,000 in the EU compared to about $9,000 in China. For our listeners, the European Parliament has played a leading role in advancing the notion of a EU-US free trade agreement. And as one published report states, it is because of the 2 regions' shared economic interests and the employment of growth it would help to generate. Mr. Helmer, from your vantage point, what are the benefits that you see and also perhaps the pitfalls for both consumers, businesses, and also taxpayers?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, that free trade is a good thing in and of itself. And therefore, we are in favor of free trade, new free trade agreements wherever we can get them. We would have been much happier to have a global multilateral free trade deal that was under discussion in the Doha round. Sadly, that came to nothing. But a good second best is to develop as many bilateral free trade deals as we possibly can. There are enormous benefits in free trade, and particularly in free trade between 2 of the world's major economies, or rather one of the world's major economies, the US, and a group of economies which together are substantial in Europe. That is going to be a good thing. What about the pitfalls? Now, whenever you have a free trade deal, of course you get winners and losers. And one of the problems is that you can rely on the losers to squeal louder than the winners cheer. So there are always difficulties, and there will be lobby groups in Brussels and lobby groups in Washington who are saying, please leave our industry out, please give us these special protections. And if we're not careful, those lobby groups may actually result in a very poor deal in the end, a deal that just doesn't go far enough. The most obvious lobby group that we're going to have a big problem with is the European farming lobby. Because part of the deal must be agriculture. American farmers and food producers will certainly want to be selling their goods under the terms of the free trade agreement in Europe. There have been all sorts of issues that you probably will be familiar with in terms of GM products, in terms of the various pharmaceutical products that are used in animal husbandry, particularly, for example, in chickens, where the European Union has resisted the import of chickens from America. So those are going to be the specifically trade issues which are going to lead to problems and which are going to be tough for the negotiators to sort out. There is one other very big area that I foresee becoming a problem, and that is that whenever the European Union does free trade deals, it likes to bring in all sorts of peripheral sort of socio-economic, environmental issues that really are just so much baggage and are not directly related to free trade. For example, the European Union is far more committed to an extreme environmental green policy than most other countries around the world. It's a wonderful irony, in fact, because, of course, in America, you are actually reducing CO2 emissions more quickly than Europe is, yet you have a much more relaxed approach to CO2 emissions. Your reduction is based on shale gas and the switch from coal to gas. In Europe, our reduction is based on massive, complex, intrusive, disruptive regulatory programs, which are actually not delivering terribly well. But I can imagine that you're going to have the European Commission, the European negotiators, trying to attach environmental requirements to any agreement. They're also very keen on labor standards, the International Labour Organization. I can imagine them trying to rake those issues up as well. The problem for Europe, of course, is it's accustomed to making free trade deals with smaller economies. I'm not suggesting for a moment that a smaller economy like, say, Singapore is going to be pushed around by Europe, but certainly Europe will feel it has a much stronger negotiating position with Singapore than it will eventually have with the US. My fear is that Brussels will go into these negotiations with the same sort of attitude that it brings to negotiations with smaller countries, and it may be rather surprised and taken aback to find that it can't push America around in quite the same way that it can push around other countries. What I would urge the American side is be ready for these requests and give them no credence at all. I think that for a free trade agreement, you should focus on trade specifically and don't let the European Union drag in all sorts of extraneous hobby horse issues that you'll end up with a sort of Christmas tree with baubles on it, and that won't do Europe any good, and it won't do America any good either.
Right. I see the agriculture you mentioned. The European farming industry is heavily subsidized through the common agricultural policy. And I believe that at one point of time, it was half of the EU budget that was spent on agricultural subsidies. The experience here is also, we talked to Maurice McTeague from New Zealand, who was a guest also in the European Parliament, and he clearly stated how New Zealand cancelled all agricultural subsidies overnight. As today we see that New Zealand's dairy products in the US may have up to 300% tariffs, which is unbelievable. How do you see this part evolving, since it is so protected in the EU as well as in the US?
Well, the first thing to say is that I think New Zealand were extremely brave and far-sighted to dispense with agricultural subsidies. Of course, everybody predicted disaster, but the disaster didn't happen, and the sector in New Zealand has done well. You're quite right that the Common Agricultural Policy is highly protectionist. It's not quite half of the EU budget, but it's, I think, about 40% is the current figure. It's a very substantial sum. And farmers, especially French farmers, I have to say, will seek to cling to that system. There is another problem with the Common Agricultural Policy, and that is that it is enormously protectionist. One of the biggest problems for food producers in poor countries in the third world is that they are effectively barred from exports, to a large extent, from exports to Europe. I've had more than one trade minister of a developing country say to me, look, we appreciate your aid, but actually you could forget the aid and just let us trade our way out of poverty, but you bar your market to our produce. So the European Union likes to talk about open markets and free trade. In fact, it is highly protectionist, and probably the worst example of protectionism is indeed the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, there's a wonderful argument about this. It's almost a sort of replay of, if you like, the airliner argument, where Airbus argues that Boeing is subsidized, and Boeing argues that Airbus is subsidized, and the truth is they're both subsidized to an extent.
Right.
US, I'm not an expert on US subsidies, but I believe there are quite a lot of subsidies in the US, particularly in the biofuels area. And certainly the European farming industry would say that American producers get implied subsidies, certainly because the price of diesel is so much lower in the US compared to Europe. And these are the sorts of areas that arguments will take place on. I think what is important for the negotiators is to say, look, we know there are going to be all sorts of problems and all sorts of resistance and all sorts of lobbyists, but the prize we are going for of free trade, which will be a big move towards global free trade if we can get Europe and America together on this transatlantic free trade deal. The prize is so worthwhile that we must find a way either around or through these difficulties.
In fact, it's been interesting to hear German Chancellor Angela Merkel when she told lawmakers recently in the parliament that it is so important for this EU-US trade deal to move forward. There are some concerns about, for example, France and Southern Europe not being as positive and supportive of this movement. Do you see a united front on the European side, or do you anticipate some hurdles as we go forward with some of these detailed areas of the trade agreement?
Well, certainly you'll get lobby groups achieving the support of some members of the European Parliament, and those debates will happen here. We've seen it before. For example, we recently had the EU-Korea free trade deal. That was a couple of years ago that was being debated. And one particular sector there that got very excited was the automotive sector. And we had enormous lobbying from the European automotive sector, terrified of imports of cheap and really rather good Korean cars, although, of course, quite a lot of the Korean cars you'll see driving on European roads have actually been assembled in Europe. So those are the sorts of areas that come up. There will be resistance in the Parliament. We haven't had a vote on it yet that I've seen, so I couldn't actually give you any hard numbers. But my guess is there will be broad support, which I would hope would overcome the resistance of particular national or political groups who may take a stand on one or other issue, even the farming lobby. And the farming lobby is certainly going to be the most powerful, I would think, lobby in the European Parliament. Just one point that I would like to add here. We see a lot in Europe, a charity initiative called Fair Trade. I don't know if you have the same system in the States. But that's where producers, say, of coffee, will do a deal where the people actually working in the coffee fields in the third world get favorable terms and social support and so on. And everybody thinks this is a wonderful idea. But frankly, and I said this again and again, the fair trade deal, the sort of subsidies that are going to these people, are trivial compared to the benefits they would get if they had market access. So European protectionism is the problem, and frankly, these charity initiatives like the Fair Trade deal are not really a solution.
A US-EU working group was established in 2011 to discuss the prospect of free trade agreement. And according to some experts, they're saying that it may take 2 more years in order to get to the point of really putting something on the paper. With British leadership now and presidency of the G8, do you think that would be beneficial for expediting the trade agreement?
I would certainly hope so. The British government, I could criticize it on many grounds, but I think on the issue of free trade, they are, as I would say, sound. They believe in free trade. They are committed to free trade. And certainly the UK will try and take this forward and facilitate it. That said, though, I mean, it will be one of the most complex and perhaps difficult free trade deal negotiations that the world has ever seen, I should think. I mean, it is a mammoth task, the number of issues that are going to arise on both sides. And so I wouldn't have thought that 2 years was unrealistic, and it's probably better to have it right than to have it immediate.
It is interesting to note, Roger, just a few weeks ago we had Ambassador Terry Miller, the director for the Center for International Trade and Economics at the Heritage Foundation. And as he was communicating the importance and significance of economic freedom, he communicated the importance of trade freedom, something that we overlook at times. And in the 2013 Index of Economic Freedom, he wrote that there has been no boost in trade freedom. And in fact, the latest rankings of the trade freedom around the world, developed by the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal, basically states that how citizens of countries that embrace free trade are better off than citizens of countries that do not. He states that the case for pending trade agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership from the U.S. side, the Africa's Continental Free Trade Area, is bolstered by international statistics showing a strong correlation between trade freedom and a variety of positive indicators, including economic prosperity, low poverty rates, and clean environments. And I think that is something that you had alluded to earlier on in your comment about cleaner environments, whereby a more free market approach certainly focused on the rule of law, is a better way for us to enjoy a cleaner environment than heavy regulation and government intervention. But it also shows the importance of trade freedom, where if it is boosted and encouraged and certainly supported from all corners, it could truly make a significant difference in boosting economic growth rates at a time when the world needs changes.
Well, that's absolutely true, and I completely agree with it. There is a historical perspective on this. It's certainly the case that when populations in a country reach a certain stage of prosperity, they are beyond a subsistence existence. They're starting to enjoy some of the benefits of consumer markets. They start to demand improved environment. We're just seeing that at the moment in China, where citizens' movements are protesting against the appalling air pollution in Beijing, for example. We've seen massive economic growth. The focus has been on economic growth, completely ignoring environmental issues. Suddenly, they're becoming concerned about the environment because the citizens are demanding it and becoming very restive and conducting demonstrations and so on. So prosperity itself is a force for a cleaner environment, and obviously free trade contributes to prosperity. So the steps follow on naturally from each other. The other example I would give, and we alluded to this briefly earlier, is the contrast between Europe and the USA. The USA, I mean, I know you do have environmental legislation in place, of course you do, but nothing like as onerous and complex as the environmental regulation we have in Europe. And yet market forces are delivering a reduction in emissions in the US, whereas the heavy regulatory environment in Europe is doing far less well. And I've been seeing this recently. In fact, in the last 24 hours, I've had meetings with the UK refinery, oil refinery business. The oil refineries work on pretty tiny margins, and they reckon that the actual cost per litre of 3 major pieces of European legislation, including something called the Fuel Quality Directive, is actually going to put more costs per litre on their product than actually their profit margin. So in other words, they're going to be forced into a loss-making position. They can't increase their prices because they're under competitive pressure from imports. And the European Union, therefore, is doing what it does so well and so often. It is creating an environment in which it is not worth investing in Europe. If you're looking at investing in the oil refining business, you're not going to put your investment in Europe because you look at the very uncertain regulatory environment, you look at the very high cost of regulation, and you say to yourself, I would rather put that investment in the United States or in India or in a variety of other countries rather than put it in Europe, because if I put it in India, I know roughly what the regulatory environment is going to be. I know that the regulatory costs are going to be lower. The cost of transport is very low anyway, so it's cheaper to refine my oil in India and bring it to Europe rather than refining it in Europe. That's just one industry. And I could, if you had time, I could take you through industry after industry after industry where it is becoming more attractive to produce elsewhere outside Europe. First, because of the very high price of energy as a result of all these environmental measures. And second, because of the regulatory environment, which is just very difficult to predict. And what we've done in Europe is we've given ourselves, with a few exceptions, just about the highest energy costs in the world. You in America have this shale gas revolution, which, frankly, I envy you. It is a wonderful gift from fortune for the United States of America. You look at India and China. They have very low-cost coal-fired power stations, and they're building lots more coal-fired power stations. In Europe, we have extraordinarily complex emissions trading, and America, please don't put in an emissions trading system. We have a range of other, as they say, instruments that are designed to reduce emissions and promote a clean environment, but actually have the effect of driving business abroad. And the ironical thing is that many of the places that investment might go to, for example, India, would actually have lower environmental standards than Europe would have. So our green policies are, first of all, undermining business and costing jobs in Europe. But secondly, they are increasing global emissions because that business now goes not to Europe, where there are high environmental standards, but, say, to the Far East or wherever, where there are lower environmental standards. One example quoted to me by the steel industry, they reckon that because of the tight environmental regulation, a ton of steel in Europe involves emissions of about a ton of CO2. If you make the same ton of steel in China, the emissions are about 3 tons of CO2. That is the sort of contrast. So by forcing business and jobs and investment out of Europe, we're not actually making the world any greener. We're actually increasing emissions. It is an entirely self-defeating policy.
Mr. Helmer, you have been mentioning about the significance of freedom and economic freedom and your concerns about the regulation and also the directives coming from Brussels. You were formerly a member of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, and you made a transition to the United Kingdom Independence Party, known as UKIP. For those of our listeners in the United States, there has been quite a bit of a challenge in this whole process of seeing a lot of the EU member states having to abide by just numerous legislation coming from Brussels. And Mr. Helmer, Prime Minister David Cameron recently pledged to hold a referendum on whether the country should remain a member of the European Union within 2.5 years of the next general election, which is due in 2015. And what has been your response to Mr. Cameron's promise?
Well, if we go back to 2007, Mr. David Cameron gave a cast-iron guarantee, that was his phrase, not my phrase, a cast-iron guarantee for a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which was the last big development of European integration. And he never delivered. He failed to deliver on that promise. So we've got a prime minister who failed to deliver on a cast-iron guarantee. He's now made a highly conditional offer of a referendum a long time in the future. It depends on, as he says, it depends on a renegotiation of our terms of membership, which hasn't even started yet. and in fact won't start, he says, till after the general election in 2015. It depends upon a majority Conservative government being elected in 2015, which many people think is not very likely. It depends upon Mr. David Cameron still being Prime Minister after 2015, which is by no means guaranteed. I mean, we couldn't trust his cast iron guarantee. I certainly don't trust this vague conditional promise a long way in the future. And the other thing he has said is that he will get a renegotiated terms of membership package, and he will then campaign, in his phrase, heart and soul, for Britain to stay within the European Union. Now, we have opinion polling data that shows that a majority of British voters today, given the choice, given the referendum, would vote to leave the European Union. Personally, I'm with that majority who want to leave, and I'm not impressed by a Prime Minister who gives us some rather vague promises and then says, even after all those promises are fulfilled, he will still campaign for Britain to remain in membership. The European Union is making us poorer and less democratic and less free, and it's time we got out of it.
A recent research, Roger, showed that 32% of those who voted Conservative in 2010 are saying they would vote UKIP in 2014. And you stated that if Britain would leave the EU, you would be better off as a country, you would get more growth, more jobs, lower energy prices, lower taxes, and you will have more flexible labor market. The Lisbon Treaty and the other treaties, there is a provision for the countries to leave the EU. In particular, you mentioned Article 50, which gives a period of disengagement and negotiation, and that would not affect the trade.
Well, my belief is that it would not affect the trade. Of course, people who support our membership, they make preposterous claims that trade and jobs depend upon membership of the European Union. Now, of course, the jobs depend on the trade, the jobs don't depend on the membership. And clearly, the trade would continue. The example I like to use, because the automotive sector has been very vociferous about their concerns about market access, those guys down in Munich will still be very keen to sell their BMWs into Britain. Right. And all the other European manufacturers, Audi, Mercedes, Citroën, Renault, Fiat, all these guys, they will continue to want to sell their cars in Britain. And we have many car manufacturers in Britain. Car manufacturing is one of the bright points, actually, in the British economy at the moment. And we will continue to sell our cars in Europe. So the trade will continue, the jobs will continue. The massive costs of membership will be unwound. A latest estimate by Tim Congdon, who's a very prominent economist in the UK, suggests that the total cost of membership, not just the annual budget payments, but the regulatory costs and all the other associated costs of membership, amount to around 10% of British GDP. Now, when we've been in recession, or more or less in recession, close to recession, for several years, and we are desperate for growth, desperate for new jobs, we just can't afford a cost of 10% of GDP, which is actually buying us nothing but trouble and regulation. If we could recover that 10%, and we wouldn't get it all back on day one, but as we unwound the European Union regulation over a period of time, we would save those costs. We could use them to consolidate our fiscal position. We could use them then to reduce taxes. We would be out from under the EU's lunatic energy policies, and we could therefore have cheaper energy. We would continue to have market access. We would have more flexible labor markets. If you look at it from the point of view of an inward investor, market access, lower taxes, lower energy costs, more flexible labor markets, of course you're going to want to come to Britain rather than going to France or Germany for your investment.
Right.
Indeed. Roger, you've been mentioning about this very unique by-election that is taking place in England. And in fact, the BBC, James Landale, the deputy political editor, states that all sides expect UKIP to do better than initially thought. They say the anti-politics move is thriving, where many voters appear hostile to politicians. They're worried about immigration. They feel ignored and taken for granted by Westminster. And frankly, they're fed up with people stuffing paper through their letterboxes and asking the same questions over and over again. And Mr. Landale believes that this may benefit UKIP. What are your thoughts in regard to this special election taking place, and how would it affect UK politics and UKIP, perhaps?
Well, I think what you're saying is true. Let me just give you a little bit of background. If you go back 5 years, UKIP was seen as a minority single-issue party with only one prominent person in it who appeared occasionally on the television. That's the party leader, Nigel Farage. And we were sort of 2 or 3% in the opinion polls if you were lucky. Over the last year or 18 months, indeed, roughly in the period since I joined, although I don't suggest for a moment that was the reason for it, over that period, there has been a dramatic shift. And from being 2 or 3% in the opinion polls, we're now in the mid-teens. We are regularly ahead of the Liberal Democrats, who you recall are the other party in the coalition. So we're clearly the third party in the opinion polls. But interestingly, we are regularly doing significantly better in by-election results than even the opinion poll data. We had a by-election about 4 months ago where we came in the high teens. We had one about 3 months ago where we came in the low 20s. And I can't tell you where we're going to come tomorrow. The Eastleigh by-election is going to take place. But it really is a three-horse race. It's the Liberal Democrats who've previously held the seat. It's the Conservatives, who are roughly neck and neck with the Liberal Democrats. And it's UKIP, the UK Independence Party, coming up on the rails, as we like to say. Nigel Farage is a racing man. We could be very close to the other two. So we're looking for another record result in a by-election, and we will be very close to the winner.
Terrific indeed. Thank you, Mr. Roger Helmer, for joining us on America's Roundtable this weekend. We will certainly be following the by-election taking place in England and give our listeners an update. And we definitely look forward to providing a brief update in regard to what is transpiring in England.
Thank you, Mr. Helmer.
My pleasure.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at AmericasRT. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.